Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of Deepthink. I'm your host, Antoun Issa. Before I welcome our very first guest, I think it's worth explaining to you why we're launching a podcast at Deepcut News and what we're hoping to achieve. Podcasts are a crowded space. There seems to be a new one launched every second week. But even with the inundation of podcasts out there, we still sensed a gap in the discourse, particularly in Australia. There's a lot of news and current affairs couched in infotainment, and a lot of them are brilliant. It's an Australian style to consume serious topics through a comedic lens. But we also felt there's a need to engage serious topics without the comedic overlay, without the skits, without the memes, without the jokes. As the name suggests, the intention of this podcast is to think deeply about the social, political, and geopolitical issues shaping Australia and the world. We want to invite smart guests, experts and thinkers and zoom out to analyse the world around us. This is for the listeners who want depth, not just headlines. We want to offer a space away from social media's rage-baiting algorithms, where you can simply listen to what we hope are thoughtful, insightful and informative discussions. And we hope after every episode you walk away feeling like you've learnt something new, or at least have a better understanding of the issues that we're discussing. At this stage, we're planning on producing an episode every 2 weeks. We've received enough support from the community to get some equipment to do a podcast. So first of all, thank you to all of those who have contributed to Deepcut News in the last 10 months. But we're still doing this part-time as we work other jobs to keep up, like many of you, with the soaring costs of our lives. But we are committed to delivering independent journalism, even if it looks a bit rough on the edges. If you'd like to support us so we can quit our jobs and focus solely on delivering independent journalism, you can by going to our website at www.deepcutnews.com. There, you'll be able to either donate directly as a one-off or recurring, or subscribe as a paid subscriber. Now, let's get into the discussion. Anthony Albanese was the first leader to come out to support the US and Israeli war on Iran. And he's maintained that support, despite the fact that this war is hurting millions of Australians. We're in the midst of a fuel crisis. Hundreds of petrol stations are already running out of fuel, and insane prices are only going to get higher and higher as this war drags on. It's also going to impact food prices as Australia imports huge quantities of fertiliser from the Persian Gulf, which is essential for our own food production. The Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, says the war could wipe out $16.5 billion from our economy, and we've just had a second consecutive interest rate rise. So clearly, if we're just looking at this war from solely an Australian perspective, it doesn't seem that this war is in our interests. So how on earth is the Labor government, as well as the Coalition and One Nation, still supporting this war? It just doesn't make a lot of strategic sense. And with me to unpack this all is a man who has analysed, monitored and worked in Australian foreign policy for years, and that's Green Senator David Shoebridge. I spoke with him a short while ago. Senator, welcome to Deepthink, and thank you for being our very first guest. Let's dive straight in. Looking at this war from the lens of Australia's interests, how do you assess how this war is going and its impact on Australia?
Well, I mean, from Australia's national interest, it's been a disaster. You know, if by what you mean the national interest is the interests of the Australian people, you know, our interest in having a resilient economy, having jobs that are going to be sustainable, being able to afford food and groceries, being able to get access to fuel supplies to get around the country. When you're considering the interests of the Australian people, it's been a disastrous war. And, my fear is it's going to become even more damaging for the Australian people. If you're looking at it from a kind of the class of security, the security class, the defence, ASIO in Canberra, well, perhaps they think it is somewhat in their interests because they can see themselves, their ongoing relationship with Washington, which is where many of their careers are based. It might be suiting their very narrow interests, but from a interest of the Australian people, you'd have to say this has been a disaster.
Right, yeah. Well, I want to share this data point from the International Energy Agency, which was published in The Guardian. The global average of days of fuel reserves held by a country is 141 days. In Australia, it's 49 days. We're among the lowest, at least in the OECD, in terms of the amount of fuel we have in storage. How is that possible? We're an island nation dependent on imports. How are we so unprepared for this?
Well, I mean, the previous government's plan was even more bizarre. The strategic oil reserves under the Morrison government were held in Texas. So I think the reason we're so unprepared with this is because there's a refusal in much of the senior defence, senior DFAT, senior decision makers to accept just how vulnerable and reliable we are on the United States. Their assumption is that our relationship with the United States will somehow insulate us from these global shocks and global impacts that might be, incredibly damaging to other economies, Indonesia, India, but somehow there's this unquestioned assumption that our, absolute lock on with the United States and the United States alliance will somehow insulate us from that. And and therefore that kind of long-term thinking about what Australia's national interest is, what we should be doing ourselves to protect our economic resilience, doesn't really get much of a thought. The assumption is the United States will sort this out for us. Somehow our absolute lockstep with the United States will protect us. And all of those assumptions are unraveling. And I suppose, Antoun, right, there is a lack of there is a lack of imagination inside much of Russell, ASIO, Defence and the Parliament. That complete lack of imagination is why we find ourselves in this situation.
Right. And just for our listeners, I just pulled up that chart with the fuel storage per country. The Netherlands is atop with 469 days. Denmark has 371 days. Finland, 292 days. Japan, which is another island nation and heavily dependent on oil coming from the Middle East, that's at 208 days. And Korea, 200 days. Australia, 49. Just want to repeat that. Albanese was the first to support the war when all the other allies were hesitant. Britain, Germany and Canada have all come out very bluntly to say that they're not getting involved in this war. This isn't their war. We haven't done that. In fact, Albanese rejected Trump's accusation that Australia said no to supporting the war. And I just want to highlight this quote from March 21, where the PM said, and I quote, "We have done what we have been asked to do." Now compare that language to the German president, who said that this war is a violation of international law. He was very clear that they weren't supporting it. Even Keir Starmer, the UK Labour British Prime Minister, came out and said, we are not getting dragged into this war. Why won't Albanese just come out and say to Trump, no, we don't support this war, we're not getting involved, like all our other allies have done?
Well, I mean, I think that's the core question here. And my reading of what's happening in Canberra is it wouldn't matter if we had the coalition in power or Labor in power, or heaven help us, One Nation in power. The settings are the same. And this refusal to challenge or question the United States alliance. Now, the fact that Albanese was, I think, the first world leader to back this in, the fact that we've had this kind of weird dance with the Defence Minister, Richard Marles, about when Australia sent military personnel into the region, and we've sent a wedge-tail military surveillance / air warfare asset into the region. We sent 85 personnel with it. We had this bizarre dance, if you remember, where Richard Marles said, yes, we had multiple requests for assistance from the United States. And then we had one request for assistance from the United Arab Emirates, and we responded to the request from the United Arab Emirates as though they wanted us to believe that. We then have Albanese coming out and saying, well, we've done everything the United States asked for. And I think that's true. We have done everything the United States asked for. The only reason we haven't sent naval assets into this war, in addition to the air assets into the war, is because we don't have any naval assets that would be able to assist or be of use in the region. Our surface fleet is not designed to defend itself against drones and missile strikes. In anything we sent into the region would just be a major vulnerability. And so it's not because there was a principled decision not to send naval assets in. It's just we didn't have anything that would survive. Our surface fleet wouldn't survive a confrontation with the Houthis and their assets, let alone with Iran. So I think when Albanese says we have done everything the United States has asked, I think we should believe him. And I think it's fundamentally true. And so what are we doing? Well, we're providing the wedge tail, which is a scarce and important resource in what is predominantly an air war at the moment. We've provided diplomatic backing. We retain our hundreds and hundreds of personnel embedded in the United States military. We are ensuring that Pine Gap and Northwest Cape can be used in US global warfighting. And there's an uncritical acceptance of the legitimacy of this illegal war. Why is that happening? Well, I think the Labor government is deeply frightened of confronting Donald Trump. I think they fear that if Trump, say, cancelled AUKUS or made some kind of other response to an even mildly firm statement, I don't think they feel they could defend that from an attack from the coalition and One Nation. And it's a spinelessness that it's hard to watch in the federal parliament, a complete inability to say, well, we're going to challenge this, we're going to back in Australia's national interest, and we're going to mount the arguments to support that. They just don't seem to have the spine or the courage to do that. But I think...
and just with the wedge tails, I think it's also good to note.
Yeah, I think the other thing is...
Go ahead.
A lot of people are saying, well, the Labor Party, they would want to, but, they're having to fight their better angels in order to continue to, comply with Donald Trump. Actually, that's not my reading of it. The likes of Penny Wong and Richard Marles and Albanese, they believe in this stuff. They believe in this unquestioning alliance with the United States. They think that is how, their careers will progress. They believe that that's our role in the world. And people are asking me, well, surely they know better. I think the more challenging conclusion that I've come to is they believe in this. They actually believe that enmeshing ourselves with the United States is somehow in our national interest. And that's even more challenging.
But if we take it at that point that they actually believe that this is the path to pursue, looking at this just from an international relations perspective, the position doesn't seem to make strategic sense. You've got a war that is clearly impacting Australia in a negative way. As I said, the Treasurer Jim Chalmers said $16.5 billion could be wiped from our economy. Inflation's going up. We're running out of fuel. Food prices are going to go up. The actions of the US and Israel, our primary allies, are directly adversely impacting Australia. Even if you align with the US and Israel on their positions in the region geopolitically, as a foreign policy. But in terms of domestic and your national interest, it doesn't make strategic sense, which then gets to my question now. Do they have strategic depth at government level, at national security level, in actually cultivating and coming up with policies that are, this is how we've got to think about the world and this is how we've got to assess our own policies?
Two responses to that. First of all, if you're in a senior defence position inside the ADF, your career is mapped out through your role, if it's a warfighting role, your role in having a career delivering a US weapons platform. It could be the F-35 fighters, it could be a battle management system, it could be Tomahawk missiles, it might be nuclear submarines. Your career is mapped out through your engagement with incredibly expensive long-term US weapons platforms. And that creates a huge careerist incentive to retain the relationship inside the ADF. Inside the bureaucracy, they have been spending the last 5 decades enmeshing ourselves with the United States, and our entire defence structure is designed to be interoperable with the United States. It's not intended to have an independent operating capacity. Our purpose for our army, our purpose for our air force, our purpose for our naval assets is to form a part of US deployments far from Australia's shore. So, and then the political class has been backing that in for decades as well. So if you want to then start distancing yourselves from the United States, there is no career path to do that inside the ADF. There is no career path to do that inside the Defence Force. There is no inside the Defence Department of Defence. There's no career path to do that inside DFAT. It is career limiting to come and challenge these things because there is such a weight of bureaucracy, such a weight of investment, such a weight of political capital that's devoted to us being a small interoperable part of the US military. And I think we shouldn't underestimate that bureaucratic self-interest and inertia that is driving us down this pathway, even though any rational view of the world would say that is incredibly reckless. But then, right. in the moment now...
And self-defeating as well.
Utterly self-defeating, utterly and incredibly, dangerous for the interests of the Australian people. But the other thing is you're asking, well, what's the strategic goal from the engagement that we're having at the moment? What's the strategic goal from sending the wedge tails across? What's the strategic goal from offering political support to the US and Israel? Letting bases be used. What is it that the Australian government hopes to achieve from that? Because obviously it's incredibly damaging to our economic future. Australian military personnel lives are at risk. Obviously there's all those problems. But what are they hoping to achieve? Well, if you look at some of the analysis from, say, Clinton Fernandez about our deployment into the Iraq war, our deployment into the war in Afghanistan, both of which wars were disastrous for the United States, disastrous for Iraq, disastrous for Afghanistan, saw Australian personnel killed, attacked our reputation in Afghanistan because of, allegations, I think incredibly credible allegations of war crimes. On any objective view, those two deployments were disastrous. Huge amounts of money spent from Australia, even more from the United States, destruction in Iraq, destruction in Afghanistan. But if you were to ask, the people in Russell, the defence quarter here in Canberra, their view is that we won those wars. We won Iraq. We won Afghanistan from an Australian perspective because our goals were never about winning the war. They were never about helping the people in Iraq. They were never about helping people in Afghanistan. What we wanted to do with our contributions in those two wars was show our relevance and loyalty to the United States. And that was what it was about. And we did. We showed our relevance and loyalty to the United States. We backed in our indispensable partner in their minds. And despite all the objective analysis about how damaging and disastrous those wars were, they think we won them. And we're seeing that play out again now.
Mm. And I think at the moment we're also seeing a bit of a reality in terms of what the Australian relationship with the US looks like and how it differs from other US allies, like in Europe, where they're talking about rearming, where they're talking about trying to kind of distance themselves from the US. Canada is doing so. And yet Australia, as you're saying, whether it was due to a bureaucracy and a military that are just full of self-interest and careerism, but they've got Australia to a point where, as you say, we're kind of wedged in the US military. So is it a case now where, okay, we might have a Labor government that has a conviction of being part of and supporting the US in everything that it does, but even if we had a Labor government or any government that decided, you know what, like the Canadians now, like the Europeans now, we've got to start pulling back. Are we able to pull back, or are we so deep in the US military? Are we so deeply kind of intertwined into the US military that we just don't have the choice now?
Well, we absolutely can pull back, but we shouldn't pretend it wouldn't come at significant cost. I have quiet chats with Labor backbench members in the corridor. I won't name them, but multiple. Their response when we have a discussion about the war, and they say, "Oh, David, I can see what you mean, but think about, how could we possibly?" And the fear of Donald Trump, the fear of US retribution is very, very real, and I think we shouldn't pretend that it wouldn't be real. Like if it's very hard to sort of tiptoe away from such an enmeshed relationship. The United States will see what we're doing and they'll no doubt take some retaliatory action. I mean, we sometimes we see reports about fear about Australia being invaded or the subject of a foreign military intervention. The only foreign military that really worries me is the United States military. They've got a huge footprint here. But I think the likelihood is we would have incredible difficulty maintaining a bunch of US weapons platforms. They would stop supporting the F-35 fighter. They'd stop supporting some of the battle management things. They would stop supporting a number of incredibly expensive US platforms that we've bought. And that would create, significant uncertainty inside our defence force. But then what are all those systems designed for? They're not designed to defend Australia. They're designed to be part of US global deployments thousands of kilometres away from Australia's shore. So yes, there would be that short-term, quite significant impact. But then it would allow us to to fundamentally review what Australia's defence posture should be. I mean, why are we getting nuclear submarines? We're getting nuclear submarines to join in a US conflict against China in the South China Sea. That's what nuclear submarines for. Why do we have F-35s? We have F-35s so we can deploy them as part of US deployments, perhaps in Southeast Asia, perhaps in the Middle East. These are not assets designed to defend Australia. If we got rid of the philosophy that our defence is solely by being part of US deployments thousands of kilometres from our shore, and instead we said, well, actually, we're going to have a Defence of Australia strategy. We're going to have like an echidna strategy where we're going to realise that we have an amazing geopolitical strength, being we live in one of the most geopolitically secure parts on the planet. We have immense benefits in geography. We have neighbours that aren't threatening ourselves. We have, a huge amount of geopolitical assets that we can use to have a Defence of Australia approach, where instead of us building incredibly expensive weapons platforms to project force thousands of kilometres from our shore, we have far, far cheaper weapons platforms designed to sort of defend Australia and its continental and air approaches. And we say to our neighbours, we're restructuring our defence. We're restructuring our defence to be defensive. We're not threatening you. We would urge you to restructure your defence forces to be defensive and non-threatening in terms of your neighbours. And it would be a hopefully virtuous circle that we'd start forming in the region. So yes, it would come at cost, but largely it would come at cost that we would no longer be able to be part of US deployments around the rest of the world. And that's probably I think unquestionably in our national interest. But, it'd be very, very
it sounds
grinding transition.
Yeah, it sounds like, we've outsourced essentially our national defence as well as our foreign policy thinking to Washington. And as a result of that, we haven't realised our own strengths of managing our own defence in a way that doesn't require us to be tethered to an empire that's gallivanting around the world and bombing left, right and centre.
This idea we need a great and powerful friend from Europe or North America to defend ourselves is incredibly dangerous and fundamentally false. The only country that is more geopolitically secure than Australia is New Zealand, and that's because it's on the other side of Australia. So if we leant into our geopolitical strengths, if we saw our neighbourhood here in Southeast Asia as our neighbourhood and our adjoining countries as partners rather than threats, there are a huge number of geopolitical strengths we could lean into. And I think Australians want us to do that. They want us to start living comfortably in our region. And I think they're seeing at the moment just how hostage we are to the United States. It's not an alliance of equals. We're in a hostage relationship with the United States, and we should get out of it sooner rather than later.
You spoke of the nuclear submarines and the F-35 fighter jet, both of which are very expensive pieces of military hardware. It's not uncommon for smaller powers in the world to turn to a great power like the US, which we've seen over the last few decades, and be like, set up your bases here. If you have bases here, we feel more secure. Japan has done it. South Korea have done it. The Gulf Arab states have done it. But as we've seen in the last a month now of war, the Iranians, with relative ease and with very cheap drones, have been able to inflict serious damage on those US bases in the Gulf Arab states, knocking out very expensive radars, very expensive air defense systems. We've now got voices in the Gulf questioning their security arrangement with the US and wondering whether hosting these bases actually put them in the firing line, and they're all suffering a tremendous economic cost from being pummeled by the Iranians, as opposed to protecting them. Now, Australia has US bases, Pine Gap being one, and we have another base in Darwin. If the US can't defend their bases in the Gulf, how would they be able to defend their bases here? And what would stop, say, China, should a conflict erupt, and who has far more sophisticated weaponry than Iran, from knocking out Pine Gap or Darwin?
Well, I think the world's getting a lesson in just how vulnerable having US bases on your soil makes you at the moment. Now, I think the Gulf states had been operating under that assumption, for decades now, that US bases will mean the US is committed to their economic future, to their military security. And you can see how that was sort of an underpinning of this rash of US bases all throughout the Gulf region. What they've now found is that actually the US, far from treating those nations as partners and security partners, commenced this war without consulting them. I mean, maybe there was consultation with Saudi Arabia, but the rest of the Gulf states, their economic interests, their security interests were never considered by the United States at the start of this war. Commences a war without consulting them. And as a result of that war, the US and Israeli attacks on Iran, all of their security assumptions are now unraveling. These bases are not keeping them safe. These bases are making them a target. These bases are making the region less safe. All of their economic assumptions, many of those Gulf states were building their economy on the assumptions that they are pockets of security, long-term investment centres for people's wealth and retirement, secure places to live and park your wealth. All of that has been thrown out the window, and their entire economic underpinnings are fundamentally challenged, and they never got a say, let alone consultation. So, and of course, the physical security is of a US base has been shown to be an utter myth. And as you point out, we have the ability of this asymmetry of very cheap drones being used to soak up incredibly expensive US air defense systems in an asymmetrical war, which, the US has a limited capacity to continue to fund and the Gulf states can't do on their own. So that's playing out in real time. And meanwhile, what is Australia doing? Australia is in the middle, the Albanese government is in the middle of spending $8 billion of our money to build the United States a nuclear submarine base on Garden Island, just off Fremantle and Perth in Western Australia. They will have that nuclear submarine base up and running by 2027. And it's designed to have 5 US nuclear submarines effectively permanently stationed there so that they can have a shorter trip up into the Straits of Malacca and into the South China Sea in order for global warfighting plans between the United States and China. China can see that being built. They know what its purpose is. We are paying for it. Like, it's extraordinary. Australian taxpayers are paying for it to build this nuclear submarine base. And defence hawks in the US, when they're asked about it, I mean, they're not fools. The ones who are hot to trot for building this base and are astounded that Australia is paying for it, they will openly admit that if there was a conflict between the United States and China, that base off Fremantle would be a priority target because of its proximity to the Malacca Straits, because it's a key US security. It would be a priority target. So too would Pine Gap, and so too in particular would Northwest Cape, which is just north of Exmouth, just outside Exmouth in Western Australia, which is one of the principal ways the United States communicates with its submerged nuclear submarine fleet. Like, I don't think there's any question that they would be priority targets. And the only reason that Australia would be threatened in such a conflict is because we have US bases. They are not keeping us safe.
Right.
They are absolutely making us a target. And worse than that, not only do we become a target, we become involved in the next US war regardless of what the cabinet decides or the prime minister decides or the defense minister decides. We will be in the next US war because of the architecture of our relationship with the United States. And it's, this submarine base, which is a core part of the AUKUS project, is doubling down on that dangerous surrendering of any kind of sovereign capacity to avoid the next US war.
Well, I want to shift to the UK Greens. Now, one thing I'll just say before we start this is that before this episode, we sent out a notification to our paid subscribers alerting them that we would be interviewing you in advance and inviting some questions. And several questions came through about the UK Greens. So as you know, obviously they're making a huge splash in the UK. They won a by-election. A recent YouGov poll has them in second behind Reform. They've surpassed the sitting Labor government in the polls. They have a very charismatic leader in Zach Polanski. Here, the Greens are still sitting at around 11 to 12% in the polls, which they've been hovering around for a few years now. Why are we not seeing the same momentum for the Greens in Australia?
Well, first of all, I absolutely think that what we're seeing from the UK Greens has been incredibly inspiring. And it's not just the UK Greens. Amdani in New York has run inspiring campaigns which reflect, our core political values, our core political beliefs. I think, many people were surprised to see the recent by-election success by the UK Greens in an electorate which is incredibly diverse, has a very significant Muslim community. The UK Greens, their leader is a gay Jewish man and their candidate was a white female plumber. It connected, though, across the electorate there. And I think it connected across the electorate there because they were talking about fundamental material needs, the needs for a secure job, the need for equitable public access to health and education, and really kind of challenging the very broken economic formula that has been rolled out by Labor and the Tories now for decades in the UK. Austerity, market-based solutions to everything. I think people connected with those platforms that the UK Greens were doing, and they connected with, I think, thousands of people in that electorate. So I think that, of course, is, if you look at what our platform that we took to the last election was, it was about taxing billionaires, taxing the ultra-wealthy, taxing the 1%, and providing universal services. It was speaking about human security rather than, and I think fundamentally prioritising human security. There are obviously, distinctions between the economic situation in the UK and the economic situation in Australia. People are doing it incredibly tough in Australia. Cost of living is extreme. Housing prices are extraordinary. Rents are impossible. There's a huge amount of economic suffering across the spectrum in Australia. I think, though, if you look at the economic suffering in the UK, the long-term economic malaise in the UK, the lack of hope in the UK, they're of a slightly different order between the UK and Australia. And the complete failure of the UK Labor Party to acknowledge that or respond to that or in any way distinguish themselves from the policy parameters of the previous Tory party, despite having a whacking great majority, I think has been, an absolutely fundamental part of UK politics, this complete lack of faith in the Labor project in the UK. I think, and that's seen Reform build on the right, and then after a number of years of Reform building on the right, now the UK Greens building on the left as a very effective counter response to that, a set of solutions that Labor's not offering. I think we're down that pathway in Australia, but we're not as far down that pathway in Australia. And I firmly believe that, position as Greens on the left of politics in Australia has to materially connect with people, has to say that, identify the 1% as our key, that ultra elite 1% who are screwing everyone over for their own benefit, and has to sort of meet that material moment. But I think we're on that pathway. We're just not as far down the pathway as the UK is.
Well, I just want to point out an op-ed written by your former colleague Max Chandler in Deepcut for us recently, where he said that the Greens needed to undertake a major strategic pivot. And I want to highlight some interesting stats that he included in his piece. 75% of One Nation voters think the system is broken. One Nation is outpolling all other parties among Gen X and baby boomers who say they're experiencing great financial stress. One Nation is also outpolling the Greens in this category among millennials. So it seems that One Nation is capturing this anti-establishment anger in the electorate amongst those who are doing it really tough. Shouldn't this be Greens territory, as Max was alluding to? And where are the Greens failing in their ability to connect to the working class, to the people really struggling at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think the polling that I've seen has us leading the polling in millennials. I mean, that's fairly consistent across the board. And
No, not all millennials. This was specifically with regards to those who say they're experiencing great financial stress. I think he was citing a poll from last November.
Clearly there is a growing sense in Australia that the political classes are not hearing or responding to this sort of fundamental economic stress that people are feeling. And I think one of the dangers you have when you're in Parliament, and we have 10 senators, we hold the balance of power in the Senate, we have a member elected downstairs, which distinguishes us significantly from One Nation at this moment federally. Like, we're in that balance of power in the Senate. Is you inevitably want to ensure that you use that political power and the numbers you have to engage with the processes that are going through Parliament to do the best you can, to provide the best possible material outcomes for people, the best environmental outcomes, hopefully the best strategic outcomes. And you spend a chunk of your time engaged in the kind of traditional political structure. The challenge we face is we don't believe that the current political structures are anywhere near meeting the moment, where that they have been co-opted by corporate interests. They have been, as we've discussed earlier, they are failing to even recognise the reality of this changed world we live in terms of military geopolitical interests. Like, the current architecture is not fit for purpose. And the benefit One Nation have is they don't pretend to be a part of that, and they throw rocks at it from outside. And I think that is responding to a bunch of people's observation of the political system. That is responding to many people's observation of the political system. Why would you be a part of it? It doesn't work, just throw rocks at it. And I think what the challenge for us is to engage in the system, produce the best outcomes we can with the power we have in the system, but also very clearly identify ourselves as an outsider of the system. I mean, they hate us. The Labor Party hates us.
Right.
The Coalition hates us. Corporate Australia hates us. Fossil fuel companies hate us. And within the system, they mobilise against us within the system. And we fundamentally want to change the system, but we need to make sure we keep that communication with our supporters and with people who are doing it tough, that we're actually not we don't believe in the system. We're engaging in the system, but we don't believe in the system. We want to fundamentally change the system.
But could that be part of the problem I think that the Greens are facing, in that they're stuck in between two potential identities, right? Between, we're engaging the system, and I just want to point to, for example, what the Australian Greens leader, Larissa Waters, said in an interview in January with the Saturday paper, where she spoke of a consensus approach she was taking to the Labor government, where she was saying she was willing to work with the government on passing legislation. Now, just compare that language to Zach Polanski, the UK Greens leader, who comes out and says, we're not here to be disappointed by you, with a reference to the UK Labor government. We're here to replace you. It seems that the UK Greens have kind of like what One Nation here, even though One Nation, I think, are probably putting a false front of this, but they're unapologetically being bold in owning an anti-establishment brand that's resonating with, more and more chunks of the electorate that feel like the system isn't working. Whereas I think those comments from Larissa, it doesn't sound like the Greens here are taking as clear an anti-establishment brand. It sounds more like they're trying to play that middle ground.
Well, I mean, I
Is
think
that where it's probably not going?
Well, I think you're picking
right?
one comment that Larissa's made. I think I can count, like I could point to countless comments where she has come out and said, with the full support of our party room and our backers, that the system is fundamentally failing. The 1% are strip mining our economy, our planet, repeated calls to actually challenge the way that politics works, to tax fundamentally, tax and constrain the fossil fuel companies, the sort of big corporate interests that are running the country. Like I think you could probably, pick and choose a couple of comments that I've made over my political career and suggest that I'm, that I might have some sort of comfortable relationship with the powers. I don't think it's a fair reflection of what Larissa's leadership is and where we're going as a party. But I do think, it is interesting. Like we have said repeatedly, we want to tax the billionaires class, which is what the UK Greens are saying. It's been a repeated core part of our platform. We want to take on and tax the billionaires class, which I think is fundamentally challenging the status quo. We want to remake our economy so it's delivering for people on the planet. And I think, our push for wide-scale public housing, for protection of renters' rights, for changing some of those really broken parts of our economic architecture is very clear. But, unlike the UK Greens, we are part of the political system here. And we have, with the balance of power in the Senate, we are part of the political system. So I think that's unquestionably a tension and a challenge in an activist party to be part of a political system while wanting to also tear it down and remake it in a way that is actually going to respond to the sort of fundamental challenges, economic, environmental and social challenges. And, I think we would be wrong not to be constantly reviewing how we're managing that, how we're managing to have some political power in the system, but also want to sort of tear down and remake the system. And I think it's a work in progress, but I do think the fundamental pillars of our economic platform, which is about empowering ordinary people, giving working people rights, taking on corporate interests, fundamentally changing the system. There is a huge parallel between what we're doing and what the UK Greens are doing, but we're doing it partly from within the system and partly from without the system. And I do think it's, that is a challenge, but it also means we have more political power and we're actually delivering things in the meantime.
I am going to finish off with a reader question. Several were sent, a lot of them were sent around the UK Greens, and I think we've covered that. But I think it's also a testament to the fact that I think, the people I think who follow and listen to Deepcut are people who would either vote Greens or would strongly consider voting Greens. So I think it was a good kind of indication as to what the thinking is amongst people who are looking at, I guess, the surge of the UK Greens and, hoping to see that be replicated here. But here's a different reader question that I plucked out. So many of us feel overwhelmed by the state of the world. The Epstein files have shown us so clearly that the Epstein billionaires have no regard for their fellow humans who are outside their class. There seems to be no interest in bringing perpetrators to justice for any crime, whether it's war crimes or billionaire pedophilia or corruption. Propaganda and lies abound. Is civilization as we have known it on the brink of collapse?
Well, I think that the billionaire class, the people who benefit from the status quo, benefit from a lack of hope and a lack of hope that anything can be different. And, I think we've spoken about some of the UK Greens campaigning, Mamdani's campaigning. They are fundamentally grounded in hope. Hope that we can actually remake the system, hope that we can actually hold the billionaires class to account. My personal view is every billionaire is a social policy, economic, political failure. We should remove the billionaire class from our economy and from the planet. And I think they, the only people who benefit from a lack of hope that things can be different are the people who are currently benefiting from a particularly cooked status quo. I mean, the only reason I keep doing this job is because I feel absolutely certain that the kind of policy settings that we're pushing for in this country, where we protect the climate and we protect nature, we give people secure jobs, we get, a fair chunk of the national wealth of this country to the people of this country, where we don't leave people in poverty, where we give people a kind of collective project that they can believe in and invest in and want their kids to be a part of. That's the reason I continue to turn up to the bloody Senate and deal with Penny Wong and the likes. Like, unless you have hope, you can't remake the world. So, yeah, it is tempting to see this latest obscene war being made by a handful of empowered, vilely self-interested men and think, well, bugger it, I'm just going to stick my head under the doona, I'm going to pick up a craft and I'm just going to disengage. They want us to do that. And what I think the UK Greens shows, what Mamdani shows, what 300,000 people crossing the Harbour Bridge shows, is that when we mobilise and we build hope, we can fundamentally challenge the system and we can fundamentally remake the system. Every major social advance we have, getting rid of slavery, giving women the vote, creating a weekend, having annual leave, Medicare, public education, all of these things that have made our life fundamentally better. None of them have been gifted by a billionaire class or gifted by a parliament or gifted by a political, the political class. We've fought for every one of them. And we now need to fight for the future of the planet like never before. And I don't know about you, but I'm interested in the future of the planet and I'm willing to undertake that fight, Antoun, and I'm pretty sure you are too. And, it's the hope of where we can go that keeps me engaged in this thing. And, I get it every time I meet with our supporter base. I get it every time I go to an event, with a couple of thousand people who are committed to peace. Like the one thing where if you go around this country and you meet with Australians across the country, we're all on the same team. And we just need to have that mass realisation that we're all on the same team and realise where the enemies are. And they're people like Trump and they're people like Netanyahu. And to be honest, they're the political class of the Albaneses and the Wongs who are on Gina Rinehart's side. And,
And Trump's side and Netanyahu's side.
Absolutely. Hope is the most powerful political tool we have and we need to hold on to it.
Thank you so much, Senator Shoebridge. This was a very fascinating discussion and exactly what we wanted to achieve with our new show, Deepthink. So thank you. Thank you for listening to the first episode of Deepthink. I hope you found it informative and insightful. And if you did, please share our podcast. Let's get this out there. Let's inject some smart, critical thinking into the public discourse. And if you'd like to support Deepcut News, again, you can by going to our website at www.deepcutnews.com, where you can donate or subscribe. See you next time.